The sun hung low over the bustling market, casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. Stalls overflowed with fresh produce, the scent of spices, and grilled meat mixing in the warm air. Shoppers weaved between vendors, haggling over prices, their voices blending into a steady hum. Amid the chaos, a massive 18-wheeler rumbled to a stop at the far end of the lot. The driver's side door creaked open, and down stepped a man built like a mountain, broad shoulders, thick arms, and a belly that spoke of years spent on the road. His worn-out flannel shirt stretched over his chest, and his boots hit the ground with a solid thud. To most, he looked like any other trucker, just another big guy stopping for a bite before hitting the highway again. But this man, Frank Dawson, was anything but ordinary. Frank moved with quiet confidence, his sharp eyes scanning the market as he made his way toward a small food stall. He wasn't one for attention, but his size alone made him stand out. He just wanted a quick meal, maybe some local barbecue, before getting back on the road. But fate had other plans. From across the lot, the low growl of motorcycle engines signaled the arrival of trouble. A group of bikers, clad in worn leather and dark sunglasses, rolled in, their presence immediately shifting the energy in the market. Locals turned away, pretending not to notice, while vendors lowered their heads, hoping to avoid unwanted attention. The gang had a reputation. They weren't the worst outlaws on the road, but they loved throwing their weight around, especially when they spotted someone they thought was weak. Frank, focused on ordering his food, didn't pay them any mind at first, but he felt their eyes on him. The tallest of the group, a lanky man with a greasy ponytail and a skull emblem on his jacket, nudged his buddy and smirked. "Hey, look at this guy," he sneered loud enough for others to hear. "You sure that truck didn't tip over trying to carry him?" Laughter erupted from the group. A few nearby customers exchanged nervous glances but kept quiet. No one wanted trouble, especially with this particular gang. Frank didn't react. He'd heard worse in his life. Words didn't bother him. But bullies? That was a different story. One of the younger bikers, eager to impress, took it a step further. He strutted over and gave Frank's shoulder a firm shove. Not enough to knock him over, but enough to send a message. "Hey, big guy," he taunted. "Market's kinda tight for someone your size. Maybe you should find a drive-through instead." Frank exhaled slowly, setting down his food before turning to face them. His eyes, calm but unwavering, met the bikers with an intensity that made the young man hesitate. If the gang had done their research, they would have known that Frank wasn't just a trucker. He wasn't just a big man trying to grab lunch. He was a retired Delta Force commander, and they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. The market felt different now, the lively chatter fading as more people turned to watch. A silent tension settled in the air, thick and heavy. The bikers grinned, enjoying the attention. They had pulled this stunt before, intimidating strangers, pushing people around just for fun. Most backed down, most walked away, but Frank wasn't most people. The young biker, the one who had shoved Frank, shifted on his feet. He expected a reaction, anger, maybe fear. But Frank just stood there, steady as a rock, his gaze unreadable. There was something unsettling about the way he looked at them. Not nervous, not aggressive, just calm, too calm. The leader of the group, the one with the greasy ponytail, took a step forward, twirling a toothpick between his fingers. He squinted at Frank, sizing him up. "You deaf, old man. My buddy here's talking to you," he said, tilting his head. "Or maybe you're too stuffed from all those truck stop buffets to hear properly." More laughter. Someone in the group whistled. Another cracked his knuckles, itching for more. They wanted a reaction. They fed off fear, off the way people shrank back when they got loud. Frank finally spoke, his voice deep and steady. "You done?" The simple question made the leader pause. Something about the way Frank said it, like he was just waiting for them to finish their little game, sent an unexpected chill through him. But pride was a dangerous thing, and he couldn't back down now. "Yeah, I'm done," the leader said with a smirk. Done looking at you blocking up the whole market. Maybe do us all a favor and move that belly somewhere else. Frank exhaled slowly and shook his head, picking up his food again. Not interested. That should have been the end of it. He had given them a way out, a chance to let it go. But guys like them didn't know when to stop. The younger one, still eager to prove himself, reached out and snatched the food from Frank's hands, tossing it onto the ground. Barbecue sauce splattered across the pavement, the scent of smoked meat rising in the warm air. The market went completely silent. Frank stared at the mess on the ground, his jaw tightening for the first time. Not from anger, not from frustration, but from something deeper, something old. Memories of past missions, of battles fought in places most people would never hear about, flickered through his mind. He had spent years in situations where a single wrong move could mean life or death. He had faced men much more dangerous than this, in places far worse. But here, in a quiet market, in the middle of a peaceful town, these bikers thought they were in charge. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Frank lifted his gaze, locking eyes with the leader. His voice was quiet, but every word carried weight. That was a mistake. The bikers laughed again, but there was a hesitation now, a split second of doubt. The leader scoffed, trying to shake it off. "Yeah. And what are you gonna do about it, big guy?" Frank didn't answer. He didn't need to, because what was coming next, they wouldn't see it coming. The laughter from the bikers still echoed through the market, but it wasn't as strong as before. Something about Frank's presence had shifted the air. He wasn't yelling, he wasn't threatening, but the way he stood, calm, unshaken, made it clear that he wasn't like the others they had pushed around. The leader, still twirling his toothpick, tried to act like he was in control, but there was an edge to his voice now, a flicker of uncertainty. A few of the market vendors whispered among themselves. Some had seen Frank before, just a trucker passing through, always polite, always keeping to himself. But now they were looking at him differently. One old man who ran a fruit stand shook his head. "They don't know what they're messing with," he murmured to himself. Meanwhile, a young woman at a nearby stall clutched her little boy's hand tightly. She had heard stories about this biker gang. They had been through here before, causing trouble, pushing people around just for fun. The sheriff had warned folks to avoid confrontation, that it was better to let them have their fun and leave. But this was different. This time, they had picked the wrong man. Frank's eyes never left the leaders. There was no fear, no hesitation, just patience, like the hunter waiting for his prey to make the first move. The younger biker, the one who had thrown Frank's food on the ground, was still trying to act tough. He stepped closer, puffing out his chest. "You got a problem," the young biker snapped, "'cause it sure looks like you got a problem." Frank didn't flinch. He simply rolled his shoulders, stretching them out, as if he were loosening up after a long drive. A habit, maybe, or a signal. The leader of the bikers noticed, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. "You know what?" the leader said, forcing a grin. "Forget it. Let's not waste our time." He slapped the younger biker on the shoulder, trying to move things along. "Ain't worth it, man." But the younger one wasn't ready to let it go. He wasn't used to being ignored. He wanted to prove something to the gang, to himself. So he reached out again, grabbing the front of Frank's flannel shirt in a tight fist. The world seemed to slow for a moment. The market grew quieter. Even the wind stilled. Frank finally moved. Not fast, not aggressive, just a simple shift of his arm. One hand wrapped around the young biker's wrist, firm, controlled. And in an instant, the biker's confidence wavered. Because Frank's grip was like iron. The younger biker tried to yank his hand back, but it didn't budge. His fingers twitched, his breath hitched, and his bravado cracked just a little. The leader of the gang stepped forward again, ready to intervene, but Frank didn't even look at him. His voice, steady as ever, cut through the silence. "Let go." It wasn't a request, it was a command. The young biker hesitated. His face turned red, both from effort and embarrassment. He wasn't used to being outmatched. But the longer he stood there, feeling the strength in Frank's grip, the more he realized that this wasn't a man he should have messed with. The leader of the gang shifted uneasily. He had spent years sizing people up, knowing who to push and who to avoid. And something in Frank's eyes told him this was a man who had seen things, done things, that none of them could even imagine. Frank didn't squeeze harder. He didn't need to. The younger biker's fingers finally uncurled, releasing the fabric of Frank's shirt. The second he did, Frank let go of his wrist. No show of force, no need to humiliate him, just a quiet, clear message. This was over before it even started. But some fights don't end that easily, and some men don't know when to walk away. The leader clenched his jaw, knowing that if they let this go, they'd lose respect. They'd look weak. And that wasn't something he could afford. So he did what men like him always did when they felt control slipping away. He made a mistake. With a quick nod to one of his men, he set something in motion that would change everything. And Frank knew it the moment he saw the biker move toward his truck. The market was holding its breath. People stood frozen in place, eyes darting between the bikers and Frank. Even the wind seemed to pause, the rustling of leaves and fabric dying down, as if nature itself sensed the tension. Frank's gaze followed the biker who had broken off from the group, moving toward his truck. His truck, his home on the road. Every instinct inside him sharpened. He had seen this move before, an attempt to establish control, to escalate without throwing the first punch. A coward's way of picking a fight. The leader, still standing in front of Frank, smirked, thinking he finally had the upper hand. "Guess you don't mind if we take a look at that big rig of yours," he drawled, watching Frank's reaction closely. "Maybe we'll see what a trucker like he's got hidden in there." The younger biker, who had been embarrassed moments earlier, was already regaining his nerve, feeding off the leader's confidence. He laughed, rubbing his wrist where Frank had gripped him. "Yeah, big guy, what's in the truck? You got snacks in there or something?" The others chuckled, but their amusement was laced with something else now, something unsure, because Frank hadn't reacted the way they expected. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't angry. He wasn't trying to stop them. He was just watching. But those who knew how to read a man, really read a man, would have seen the shift. The slight tightening of his jaw, the subtle way his stance adjusted, the look in his eyes, calculating and cold. The biker near the truck reached for the handle. Frank took a single step forward. The leader's smirk twitched. "Easy now," he said, lifting a hand as if to keep Frank in place. "Wouldn't want to start something you can't fin." He didn't get to finish. A loud asterisk clang asterisk rang through the air as the biker by the truck suddenly yanked his hand back with a sharp yelp. He had barely touched the handle when something inside the truck triggered, something only Frank knew was there. A silent warning system, a trick he had learned in another life, when securing a vehicle wasn't just about locking the doors. The biker stumbled back, shaking his fingers, his face contorted in confusion. "What there?" Frank's voice cut through the moment, low and steady. "That truck isn't yours to touch." The leader's expression darkened. He had been trying to push Frank into reacting, but now things were slipping out of his control. "You think you're tough, huh?" His voice carried more force now, less amusement. "Just 'cause you're big, just 'cause you're quiet." Frank exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. "Walk away." The words weren't a threat. They weren't even a challenge. They were a gift, one last chance. But the leader, feeling the weight of eyes on him, knowing his reputation was on the line, made his decision. He snapped his fingers. And just like that, 3 of his men moved in. The market erupted into chaos. Vendors gasped, customers stumbled backward, a woman pulled her child close. The bikers rushed forward, thinking they had the numbers, thinking they had the upper hand. They had no idea what was coming. The bikers lunged forward, their boots pounding against the pavement. Frank didn't move at first. He stood still, watching them come, as if measuring the speed of their steps, the angles of their attacks. To them, he was just a big trucker past his prime, slow and easy to overwhelm. But they were about to learn the truth the hard way. The first man reached him, swinging a fist straight at Frank's jaw. It never landed. In a single fluid motion, Frank shifted to the side, his arm snapping up like a coiled spring. His open palm caught the biker's wrist mid-swing, stopping him cold. Before the man could react, Frank twisted, using the biker's own momentum against him. The next thing the crowd saw was the biker flipping over, crashing onto the ground with a heavy thud. The second man tried to tackle him from behind. Frank felt him coming, his years of training kicking in like second nature. He stepped aside at the last second, sending the biker stumbling forward, off balance. Before he could recover, Frank grabbed the back of his jacket and sent him skidding across the pavement. The third biker hesitated. He had expected an easy fight, but what he saw now wasn't just a big guy who could throw his weight around. Frank wasn't even breathing hard. His movements weren't wild or panicked. They were controlled, efficient. The kind of movements that only came from experience, real experience. The market was no longer just watching. People were whispering now. Vendors exchanged looks. A few of the older ones nodded knowingly. They had seen fighters before, but this wasn't just a man who could fight. This was a man who had fought before, many times. The leader's smirk had disappeared. He clenched his jaw, glaring at Frank as his men groaned on the ground. This wasn't how it was supposed to go, but he still had one more card to play. He gave a sharp whistle, and suddenly, more bikes roared to life from the far end of the market. 6 more bikers emerged from between the stalls, their engines growling like wolves circling prey. The crowd tensed. This wasn't just a scuffle anymore. This was about to turn into something worse. Frank glanced at the new arrivals, then at the leader. His face remained unreadable. "You sure you want to do this?" The leader took a slow step forward, shaking his head. "You should have just walked away, old man." Frank sighed, rolling his shoulders. "I gave you that chance." The bikers started closing in, their boots crunching against the gravel, their hands tightening into fists. The air was thick with tension, the kind that comes right before something irreversible happens. And just when it seemed like Frank was about to be outnumbered, another voice cut through the noise. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." The crowd turned. A man stepped out from the market's edge, walking with a steady, deliberate pace. He wasn't dressed like a local. His boots were polished, his stance straight, his eyes sharp, and the way Frank's expression shifted, just slightly, told everyone that this wasn't just some random stranger. The bikers hesitated, sensing something was off. Because whoever this new guy was, he wasn't just here to watch. He was here for Frank, and that changed everything. The market fell into a stunned silence. The bikers stopped moving, their eyes shifting between Frank and the stranger who had just stepped forward. There was something different about this man, the way he carried himself, the way his voice cut through the tension without needing to be raised. He wasn't afraid, and neither was Frank. The leader of the bikers frowned, looking the newcomer up and down. "Who the hell are you?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced at Frank, a small knowing smirk appearing on his face. "Been a while, Commander." The words hung in the air like a lightning strike. The bikers exchanged confused glances, but Frank simply let out a slow breath, shaking his head. He wasn't surprised. He should have known that someone would recognize him eventually. The leader narrowed his eyes. "Commander," he scoffed, trying to brush it off. "You're telling me this guy, this trucker, is somebody?" The stranger's smirk didn't fade. He turned toward the bikers, hands casually in his pockets, completely unbothered by the tension. "Yeah, somebody who could end this whole situation in about 3 seconds if he wanted to." His gaze flicked to the 3 bikers, still recovering on the ground. "Guess you're already figuring that out." The leader's jaw tightened. He didn't like this. He had come here expecting an easy time, a few laughs at some trucker's expense. Instead, he was losing control of the situation. Badly. Last chance, The man continued, his voice calm but firm. You get your guys, you get on your bikes, and you leave. Now. One of the bikers scoffed, trying to regain some bravado. Or what? Frank finally spoke. His voice was quiet, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. Or you won't be leaving the way you came. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a bluff. It was a fact. And for the first time, the bikers seemed to understand that. The leader's fingers twitched at his side. His pride told him to fight. But his instincts, his survival instincts, was screaming at him to back down. He looked around, realizing how many people were watching now. If he walked away, he'd lose face. But if he stayed... His tongue clicked against his teeth in frustration. Then, with a sharp nod, he motioned to his men. Let's go. Slowly, reluctantly, the bikers backed away. They climbed onto their motorcycles, engines roaring to life. The leader glared at Frank one last time, his pride wounded, but his common sense winning out. This ain't over. Frank met his gaze, unshaken. Yeah, it is. The leader clenched his jaw, but he didn't argue. A moment later, the gang was gone, disappearing down the road. The market let out a collective breath. The tension finally broke, and murmurs of relief rippled through the crowd. Some people smiled. Others nodded in respect toward Frank. A few even clapped quietly. Frank turned to the stranger, exhaling. I didn't need the help. The man chuckled. Didn't say you did. Just figured I'd drop in, see if retirement's made you soft. Frank turned to the stranger, exhaling. I didn't need the help. The man chuckled. Didn't say you did. Just figured I'd drop in, see if retirement's made you soft. He eyed the bikers vanishing in the distance. Doesn't look like it. Frank smirked, shaking his head. What are you really doing here? The man's expression shifted, just slightly. The playful glint in his eyes dimmed, replaced by something more serious. Needed to find you. There's something happening. Something you might want to hear about. Frank sighed, glancing down at the spilled food still on the ground. He had planned for nothing more than a quiet stop at the market today. But deep down, he knew peace never lasted forever. He looked back at the man, nodding once. Let's talk. And just like that, the past Frank had left behind was knocking at his door again. Frank let out a slow breath, his eyes scanning the market one last time. The tension had settled, people were returning to their stalls, and life was moving on like nothing had happened. But he knew better. Moments like this didn't just fade. They left ripples, and sometimes those ripples turned into waves. The man standing beside him, an old acquaintance from a past he didn't talk about, waited patiently. Frank knew that whatever brought him here wasn't small. He could hear it in his voice, see it in the way his posture was just a little too stiff, too formal. Frank looked down at the mess on the ground. His groceries were ruined, his afternoon was shot, and he was no longer just another trucker passing through. The second that name, Commander Asterisk, had been spoken, it changed things. The bikers might have left, but they wouldn't forget. And if history had taught Frank anything, it was that men like that had a hard time letting things go. He glanced at the stranger again. You always show up with bad news. The man chuckled. Wouldn't be worth the trip otherwise. Frank didn't respond right away. Instead, he crouched down, picking up what little was salvageable from his spilled groceries. An older woman from a nearby stall stepped forward, placing a fresh bag of apples beside him. For you, she said softly. Frank met her eyes, seeing quiet gratitude there. The market people weren't just glad the bikers were gone. They were relieved. He gave her a nod, accepting the gesture without words. He straightened, tossing the bag into his truck before turning back to the man. All right, talk. The man's expression grew serious. Not here. Frank exhaled, glancing at the horizon where the bikers had vanished. His gut told him that this was bigger than just an old friend dropping by, and his gut was rarely wrong. He climbed into his truck, gesturing toward the passenger side. The man smirked, shaking his head. Still driving this beast. Frank gave him a look, still breathing. With a small chuckle, the man climbed in. The truck rumbled to life, and Frank pulled out of the market, leaving behind the echoes of the day's events. He knew this wasn't over. The bikers weren't the real problem. They were just another storm on the horizon, loud, messy, but temporary. Whatever was coming next, though, had nothing to do with a bunch of punks trying to prove themselves. This was something different, and as the road stretched ahead, Frank had the sinking feeling that retirement was about to get a whole lot more complicated. The town faded in the rearview mirror, but the past had just caught up.